Hello. So if you're about to moderate an AET assessment workshop, then this explainer is for you. It's really just a practical guide. We're going to walk through how to introduce and structure the whole session, step by step, giving you the tools you need to make sure you're facilitating a really productive and insightful conversation. So let's get started.
Right. Here's our plan. We'll start by setting the stage, really getting to grips with why this matters so much right now. Then we'll dive into this core idea of an ethical operating system and its 5 pillars. After that, we get really practical. We'll cover the flow of the workshop itself, how you interpret the results, and probably most importantly, how you turn all that diagnosis into a real strategic roadmap.
Okay, so your very first job as a moderator is to establish the why. The whole goal here is to create an environment where you can have an honest, non-defensive conversation about how the organization actually works.
Look, it's so important to acknowledge the world your participants live and work in. You've got pressures coming from AI, from the need to cut costs, and from all these societal expectations. And they're all converging at once. This creates this natural, inherent tension. And it's not because people have bad intentions, but because, well, roles are often a bit fuzzy and priorities are always competing. That's the reality we're here to talk about.
This is exactly why creating psychological safety right from the start is frankly non-negotiable. And this sentence you see on screen, it's your most powerful tool. We are here to analyze patterns, not to evaluate people. The moment you say that, it just externalizes all the tension. It frames any differences in perception, not as someone's fault, but as symptoms of how the system itself works.
Right, let's build on that foundation. What we're doing here is completely reframing what we mean by ethics. This isn't about morality, it's not about values posters on the wall, this is about governance and operational logic. Just think of it as a practical tool for making better decisions, especially when you're under pressure.
And this is the core definition we're working with. An ethical operating logic is simply the how behind your decisions. By defining it like this, we move the conversation away from something that could feel a bit judgmental and into a much more practical, strategic discussion about how effective the organization really is. So, these 5 pillars, they form the architecture of that operating system. And here's the key thing to get across. These aren't values people should aspire to, they are diagnostic lenses. They give everyone, whether they're from finance, HR, or operations, a shared, objective language to talk about really complex trade-offs without it getting personal.
For each of these pillars, we're going to use a single, really powerful question to get right to the heart of the matter. And these questions are what will guide the whole diagnostic part of the workshop.
So this first pillar isn't about what leaders say. It's about what they do when things get difficult. It's about measuring leadership by its actions in tough situations. Because really, that's the only true test of credibility and trust, isn't it? Performance and ethics aren't opposites. This pillar helps us look at how the organization makes conscious trade-offs. The goal is to see if short-term efficiency is kind of systematically winning out at the expense of long-term trust or the impact on people. Transformation can't just be dictated from the top, it has to be legitimized. This question gets people thinking about whether those who are most affected by decisions actually have a meaningful way to contribute. That's what builds real ownership and cuts down on that quiet resistance that can kill so many change initiatives.
Honestly, ethical failures often happen because of ambiguity, not because of bad intentions. If people have responsibility but no clear mandate or the authority to actually do anything, it just creates frustration and risk. So this pillar is all about diagnosing the clarity of your organizational structure.
And finally, this pillar grounds the whole discussion in the bigger picture. It forces everyone to consider the long-term impact on society, on the environment, and on the organization's reputation. Basically, its license to operate.
Okay, so now that we've got the framework down, we can move on to the practical flow of the workshop itself. The structure is really designed to take people from their own individual perception to a collective diagnosis in a very deliberate, structured way.
The process is actually pretty straightforward. Once you've set the stage, you'll split everyone into 2 groups. These groups then work separately, in parallel, to assess the organization against those 5 pillars using a simple Likert scale. Then, you bring them back together, you mirror the results, and finally, you interpret them as a whole room.
Now, as you send them off into their groups, this next instruction is absolutely vital. You need to be very clear. You are not asking them to assess their aspirations or that one time everything went perfectly. You're asking them to evaluate the norm.
what usually happens when resources are tight and the deadlines are looming.
Right, this is probably the most critical part of your job as a moderator. The groups have done their work, they have their data, now you have to guide them from just looking at scores to having a really meaningful dialogue about what those scores actually mean.
And this brings us to the most powerful moment of the entire workshop. You'll put the two radar charts up on the screen side by side. Your job is to immediately pull everyone's attention away from the absolute scores. Get them to focus on the gaps, the differences between the two groups. A significant difference in how two groups see the same reality, well, that is the finding. That points you directly to a systemic inconsistency or a big organizational blind spot.
Your role here is to gently steer the conversation. So when someone starts defending a low score, you guide them back by asking something like, okay, but what does this pattern tell us about our decision-making logic? Your job is to move them from individual stories to systemic structures, from blame to analysis. And this brings us to the final, crucial step. Look, this workshop isn't just an academic exercise. The diagnosis you create is the essential first step towards building a concrete, strategic roadmap for getting better.
The insights from the session should translate directly into tangible management actions. This could mean adjusting governance structures, maybe adapting KPIs to include some non-financial metrics, or clarifying roles and responsibilities, all leading to a multi-year plan to improve the organization's ethical maturity.
Which brings us right back to our central idea. An ethical operating system isn't a one-off project. It's a continuous cycle. You build trust, and that allows you to implement better structures. Those structures lead to a better impact, and that positive impact, well, it reinforces trust all over again.
And let's end with this powerful thought. The goal of all this work isn't to get rid of tension or conflict. I mean, healthy organizations have disagreements. The goal is to make those tensions visible, explicit, and manageable through good governance and clear structures. That is the real definition of ethical maturity.